Hello. This presentation will explore the history of trauma to different tribes of Alaskan Native people and how they are affected today. Epidemics such as smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis, and measles began affecting Native Alaskans in the late 1700s, and ultimately by 1900 some of these deadly diseases had affected even the farthest reaching Alaska villages. The title given to the time of widespread epidemics was the Great Death. Harold Napoleon, author of Yuyurok, Way of the Human Being, wrote, "This epidemic killed whole families and wiped out whole villages. It gave birth to a generation of orphans, our current grandparents and great-grandparents." End quote. In Western society, there was aid available to help communities affected by widespread disease, but the Native Alaskans had no such aid. They were forced to face these traumas and grieve their losses alone. It was about this same time that the Westerners, also referring to themselves as missionaries or teachers, began arriving in the native villages of Alaska. The Native Alaskans were told by these Westerners that their traditional, spiritual, and medical ways were like that of witchcraft, and that is why there had been so much disease, pain, and suffering among the indigenous people of Alaska, and that acculturation was necessary to rebuild their communities and families. One southeastern group, the Haida, were swiftly brainwashed into believing that their traditional ways of speaking, learning, practicing medicine, and faith needed to be abandoned as atonement for their misguided ways. Children and adults were forced to cut their hair. Children were punished for speaking their native language and were ripped away from what family remained after the Great Death, and they were put into boarding schools to encourage acculturation. In these boarding schools, children were pressured to abandon their native ways or suffer abuse at the hands of the caretakers and teachers. This created a generation of indigenous people with unresolved grief and fear, as well as having an overwhelming sense of anger and shame. I question what is meant by the term acculturation, and if in fact it is the correct term to describe the actions put upon the Native Alaskans. The word acculturation suggests a willingness by the people to adopt or absorb the culture of another group, when in reality the Native Alaskans were forced to change or suffer the wrath of the white man. Perhaps the word acculturation has been misused when describing the process of westernization. Perhaps a better word would be deculturation, suggesting that the Native Alaskans' culture was lost, taken, or abandoned. The insurgence of Western culture into Native Alaska villages and traditions caused a rapid culture change among the people of the land, and it added to the trauma that they were already suffering. Some examples of cultural change were the noticeable increase in items from the modern world, like household appliances and other technology, and the shift from subsistence and trade to the exchanging of cash, which made traditional hunting and gathering less valuable and created an unequal distribution of jobs and workloads. It began to take a considerable flow of cash to maintain even minimalistic subsistence living. The indigenous people were forced to adapt to this uneven distribution of wealth, which was determined by cash in your pocket and not by if you worked hard to produce food, shelter, and clothing for your family and community. This was a complete change to the historical values of the people indigenous to Alaska. More and more non-natives were entering villages and taking over political, educational, and health decisions that used to be in the control of the native people of the area. Family ties were lessened as family members were separated by great distances and for lengthy periods of time due to schooling, medical care, and work. Modern jobs were now necessary, but one could often only find suitable work to support families in this non-traditional way in modernized communities far from home. When family ties were reunited after many months or years, it was often tense, with some family members hanging on to traditional ways, while the more well-traveled family members were coming home westernized and had assimilated to the change. This seemed like such a betrayal to those left in the villages still fighting to hold on to their history. This perceived betrayal led to a lack of trust, causing locked doors and less inviting communities, which in turn led to vandalism and violence, now requiring a modern police presence instead of handling matters on a tribal level. The same people struggling to hang on to the spirit of their culture and traditions of lawmaking found themselves trapped in the legal expectations of the Westerners. Native people that succumbed to deculturation did not have a sense of belonging in their native communities because they either were not welcome or did not feel the connectedness to their community, often due to the lengthy periods of time that they were forced to be away. Isolation and exclusion were an effective tactic for deculturation. They also did not have a sense of belonging in Western culture, as they were taught to keep their heads lower than the non-natives and stepping off the sidewalks to let them pass, and they had to adhere to strict rules regarding where natives were allowed. Nancy Davis, another author who wrote on culture change, said, "Part of the modernization process in Alaska are some acute experiences of discrimination in white native contact. These appear likely to increase as the size of the community increases. Open confrontation is more likely to occur in towns and in those villages with an increasing number of permanent white residents. These experiences are devastating to the pride, identity, and dignity of Native peoples and may simultaneously reinforce white assumptions of superiority, setting the scene for further racial conflict." End quote. Also undergoing rapid change was the education of Native Alaskans. The values and lessons needed to be a productive member of the village in which you lived were taught to you by storytelling or in a hands-on manner by the elders of the community. Westernization caused a swift transition into boarding schools where modern education was used to destroy Alaska Native traditional methods of education and force assimilation into the dominant people's way of education. Native traditions were thought to be savagery and needed to be eradicated, particularly from the youth, to stop this savage cycle. This included dress codes and expectations for hygiene that were unreasonable for Native culture and involved rigorous and degrading inspections of the Native children. This perpetuated the disdain towards Native culture into the children of the boarding schools, creating children who were ashamed of themselves and ashamed of their families. Children were taken out of their homes and placed in non-Native families. Native women were sterilized against their will or were forced to use birth control despite some dangerous side effects. And rates of sexual abuse among Native women were significantly higher than among any other group. Walters and Simoni, the authors of work we have covered previously in class, wrote, "The cumulative effects of these injustices have been characterized as a soul wound among Native people and constitutes considerable historical trauma." End quote. The stress of these and other soul wounds greatly affected the mental and physical health of Native people. Current health issues are not simply an effect of lifestyle choice or genetics, but rather the result of generations of poverty and discrimination. There was a constant battle for health, sobriety, peace, and forgiveness. The abuse of self and others that occurred and is still occurring among Native Alaskans today is a direct result of the lingering legacy of oppression. It bred self-destruction, violence, abuse, an inability to feel and express love, and self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. In the video Family Feathers, one Tlingit mother from southeast Alaska said that everyone in her village was always drunk and her children didn't know any different. Drugs, alcohol, and violence were considered the appropriate method of confronting conflict and pain. She said that while she never beat her children, she also never told them that she loved them, nor did she hug them, and when they needed her support, they couldn't find her because she was in a bar either drunk or hungover. Some adult children in the southeastern Haida community came from abusive and neglectful families and have been labeled adult children from traumatic environments, or ACTE. They also struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder, also called PTSD, and have episodes of uncontrollable rage and suicidal thoughts. Studies done in a Northwest Alaska Inuit community regarding PTSD and suicide rates among Inuit youth indicate that multi-generational trauma and grief is a significant and contributing factor. Jack Hicks, a researcher on multi-generational trauma in Alaska Native communities, wrote, The generation of Inuit who first began to display elevated rates of suicidal behavior was the first generation to grow up in settled communities, at a time when the communities were raw and rough, when substance abuse was just beginning to ravage families, and when discrimination was an everyday fact of life. Some people who have suffered during those years have healed, but many others are passing their historical trauma on to their own children." End quote. Today, many steps are being taken towards healing the past, present, and future. Where modern therapies lack in helping the Native Alaskan people recover from abuse and addiction, traditional therapies like talking circles and drumming have been reintroduced with much success. The culture camps of the Yupik people are bringing youth back to their roots. This has also been highly successful. They are being taught about their history that for too long was kept secret and weighing heavily on the hearts of the elders, and Alaskan Native history and culture is now being taught in schools. The telling of historical stories not only has a place at culture camps, but also among all Native Alaskans trying to heal the pain of their past. One cannot change what one does not acknowledge. To break the cycle of the effects of multi-generational trauma and grief, those grieving are finally being encouraged to come forward, speak out, tell their story, and ask for support. In the southeastern town of Craig, Alaska, the community came together at the request of a father who had lost his son to a drug overdose to carve what became a 4,000-pound totem pole honoring and remembering those affected by multi-generational grief. It was called a Healing Heart Pole, and it was the first totem pole raised in Craig in many generations. It was a sobriety symbol dedicated to the youth of Craig, as well as a symbol of all that had been lost from multi-generational grief. And the whole community came together and carved it by hand, carried it over 9 blocks, and then raised it into place. One community member described a feeling of release of the pain caused by the grief from his past as he hoisted the totem pole up with his community. This healing act brought positive change to a community once ravaged with pain and suffering. It was the impetus for a community commitment to sobriety and supporting a change for the leaders of tomorrow. Some Native Alaskan villages are returning to a more naturopathic way of healing in cooperation with more modern public health facilities. They are combining to address the social problems as well as the mental and physical health issues faced by Alaskan Natives. The education between these two resources has begun to open the doors between the cultures, bringing hope to the people of the land. This healing and hope comes not just from modern medicine, but from talking, drumming, dancing, and singing, from cultural pride, and from beginning to forgive. Forgiving the oppressors, forgiving the abusers, and forgiving oneself. This increase in cultural pride has reintroduced old traditions and ceremonies that have long been buried or forgotten, and that most certainly will positively affect the healing of the Native Alaskan cultures.